Hello, good afternoon. It's Saturday and we're very happy to welcome everybody here and online to our today's talk, panel conversation, mini conference titled Fast Plus, Flere Historia, Public Space and Queer Representation. I say a few words about the history of this project and what we will be hearing today, welcoming our guests. The event started with a conversation between us and Hilde Herming, who published a book a couple of years ago about the history and meaning of public sculptures in Norway, and especially in relation to the question of gender representation. And I think she will speak about that in a moment a bit. The second starting point for our conversation today is the unveiling of the monument Bænkene til Kim, honoring the queer activist Kim Friele by artist Line Vester Grønli, which was unveiled last Thursday on the birthday of Kim Friele. And we wanted to take this occasion as a starting point for a conversation today that looks in broader terms into the mechanisms and questions of representation in public space connected to queer representation. How does public space organize representation and memory, and who has access and who is represented? Instead of talking only about art, we wanted to broaden the focus slightly and talk also about other formats which organize and perform visibility in public space, and hence the guests invited for this event today. And I want to introduce them briefly, because we welcome very warmly Cille Storile, an artist and educator working with moving images and publications. And their recent projects revolve around neurodiversity, particularly focusing on ADHD, as well as an ongoing body of work in dialogue with queer archives and pasts. And the topic, or the reason we invited Cille today, is the queer feminist platform Frank that they organized with Liv Bugge between 2012 and 2020 in Oslo. It was a really important platform very early on in the discussion in Norway, and there's recently a book published by Cille, a book about Frank in February 2021, which is a really amazing and concise and very rich history of this project space and a lot of the activities and questions that Frank dealt with and was a super important platform for. In a way, Frank is a kind of organizing principle of this evening, because of this afternoon, because the second guest, Katarina Bonnevier, is one of the contributors to the book. She's an architect, artist, and researcher, and a founding member of the Art Collaborative and in some ways also architecture office Mycket in Stockholm with Mariana Alves Silva and Therese Christiansson. And her talk will depart from Mycket's current artistic research project, which is called Troll Perceptions in the Heartland, Artistic Research to Widen Our Imagination Capacity. It's a project that's affiliated with Linnaeus University and funded by the Swedish Research Council. And we thought it's very interesting to have Katarina with us, because she has done a lot of important research on feminist or queer architecture, what that could mean and how it could be defined and discussed. And an important book that she published in 2007 in this respect was Behind Straight Curtains, Towards a Queer Feminist Theory of Architecture. And also briefly mentioned a more recent publication by Mycket, the collaborative, an issue of one of my favorite queer magazines, Girls Like Us, issue number 13, The Club Scene. And then we welcome Bjørn André Vidvei, who's joining us from Bergen. He's working at Bergen Skeiv-arkivet since 2017, where his current research focus is on communication and public outreach work. And he has done, between 2017 and 2020, an archive of oral collections of interviews from queer individuals sharing first-hand experiences. And then maybe also to mention that in the book on Frank, it is mentioned that at the time that, during the time that Frank was around and did a lot of memory work on queer identities, there was no queer archive yet in Norway. So it's a special, we're very glad that this actually has changed, and we are welcome to discuss also how an archive works here in a very archival sense. Then I mentioned Hilde Herming in the beginning. She will introduce the project Frame a bit. She's working for Norske Kunstforeninger and is there also editor of the magazine Kunst Plus. And I mentioned she published the book Norske Kvinner på Sokkel, Fast Plus in 2017 together with Kristin Johansen. I wanted to also mention a few credits. As I said, the project was initiated by Hilde and Norske Kunstforeninger in collaboration with Kunstsentrene in Norge and Norsk Billedhoggerforeningen. And we, Bergen Kunsthall, we have been invited to organize this seminar. It was overseen by Scott Elliott as curator for the live program at Bergen Kunsthall. I want to thank the live team very much for producing this event today. And I want to thank our sponsors for this event, Norske Kunstforeninger and Coro. And Platform, our series of talks, is supported by Fred Ohr. And this event is specifically also part of Reimagine Europe, our EU collaboration project, co-funded by the Creative Europe program of the European Union. A last practical note is that I mentioned a couple of books, and some of these are available in our bookshop downstairs for those interested. And I'm aware that Sille also brought copies of the book on Frank. So thank you, everybody. I hand over to Hilde to talk about the project background.
Thank you, Axel. Welcome. I've already been introduced, but my name is Hilde Herming, and I am here to give you some more background to this seminar. Back in 2012, myself and a small group of friends were looking for an opportunity to organize a project in 2013, when Norway celebrated 100 years of women's right to vote. But due to the 150th anniversary of Edvard Munch's birth, most art institutions were encouraged to celebrate him and not so much the Voting Rights Jubilee. At the same time, Norway was preparing for the Constitutional Jubilee in 2014, announcing that the statue of King Christian Fredrik was to be erected in front of the parliament as a gift from the government. Whilst many women's organizations called for a voting rights monument in response to the total absence of women represented in front of the parliament building in Eidsvolls Plass. It was not until last year that the decision was finally made to honor Anna Rogstad, who will get a memorial there in the near future. Anyways, the underrepresentation of women's monuments led us onto a national investigation, and after 6 years, our research ended in this book, Fast Plass, Norske Kvinner på Sokkel. The book covers 80 memorials of individual women, accompanied by their stories, articles, and photographs by artist Marte Aas. In the process, certain issues kept reoccurring, such as location. Not many were placed in so-called strategic or central locations, and secondly, all of them, apart from one, were initiated by individuals or private organizations, with public funding coming at a later stage. This again led to further investigations into decision-making processes and who is controlling access to our public places. The public place is considered a democratic space, but it is also a political space. and historically speaking, a very gendered space where people and institutions with decision-making power have constructed specific national or local narratives, shaping a dominant history and hence collective memories. But, as it turns out, monuments often remain invisible in the sense that we, the public, don't necessarily pay them much attention. I would argue that last year, with the event of Black Lives Matter demonstrations, many Norwegians became conscious of our colonial past as represented through some of our public monuments. Suddenly, our colonial past was put on the public agenda, resulting in heated debates about whether monuments should be taken down. And this led me to question the relationship between art institutions and museums and the public space in matters related to representation and identity politics. In the museum sector, for instance, programs and state-funded projects have been initiated to investigate a variety of perspectives: gender balance, representation of different minority groups such as immigrants, national minorities such as Sami and Kvener, queer perspectives, now even a whole year dedicated to Skeivt kulturår 2022. These matters again are reflected in collections, in public programs, recruitment policies, etc., etc. But how is this addressed when it comes to the public space and art practices related to identity politics and representation? As far as I know, there is no public program in place to encourage and investigate artistic projects in the public space that specifically deal with issues of representation. But that is not to say that the public space should be programmed or controlled according to a specific political or artistic agenda. We actually need other spaces to express statements and actions outside the limitations or regulations of an institutional body. Alternatively, it can be the only space. But simultaneously, art practices taking place in the form of performances and other short-lived happenings need to be collected or documented as complementary to, or sometimes in opposition to, the collections and programs that form the shape and history of our institutions. At this point, I would like to mention a project that in part inspired the purpose of this seminar, by Michelle A. Tisdale, who initiated Lift Every Voice, LEV, where she documented posters from the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in Oslo last June, a year ago tomorrow, I think, and turned them into an art exhibition in Kunsthall, Trondheim. So my question is, can we somehow talk of the public space in terms of a sort of scattered collection that is neither controlled, curated, or owned by any one owner? Do we lack a discourse or a vocabulary to address these issues? So, without presenting any further thoughts or conclusions, I am very excited to listen and learn more through today's presentations and conversations. On that note, I move on to Benkene til Kim, Benches for Kim, and I will read a text by Maja Økland, Chair of the Artistic Committee and Curator of a program to activate the benches. She is busy preparing for a performance tonight, so she has lent me her voice. Kvinner på sokkel i Bergen, a pillar for women in Bergen. In 2019, Bergen City Council approved a private proposal by Ådne Irene Miljeteig and Hilde Maria Boberg Andersen, both representing SV or the Socialist Left Party, for a 10-year initiative to raise 5 sculptures, statues or busts, or other artistic representations of women in the public space in Bergen. So every year for the next 10 years, sculptures or other artistic representations of individual women will be erected in visible public spaces within the city. The first sculpture honors the queer pioneer from Bergen, Karen Kristine Kim Friele, unveiled on her 86th birthday on May 27, 2021, so last week. Kim Friele, born Wilhelmsen in 1935, is a Norwegian activist. Since the early 1960s, she has been a central figure in the Norwegian gay rights movement. Friele was born and raised outside of Bergen, and she moved to Oslo in 1958. She was married to Ole Friele Jr. from 1959 to 1960, and after they divorced, Friele started to approach the gay community in Oslo. In 1962, she became involved in Det Norske Forbundet av 1948, DNF 48, the first Norwegian organization for homosexuals. Friele was also the editor of its magazine Oss from 1965 till 1969 and served as its leader until 1971, and held the position as Secretary General for the organization until 1989. Friele was at the forefront for the organization's fight against Section 213 of the Penal Code that prohibited gay sex, which was repealed on April 14, 1972, and she was also a strong contributor to the erasure of homosexuality as a psychiatric diagnosis by the Norwegian Psychiatric Association in 1977, as well as the 1981 expansion of the Penal Code sections 135A and 349A against racism and discrimination to also include discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. Friele stepped back as Secretary General of DNF 48 in 1989 and became a State Fellow that same year. Today she has retired and lives in Geilo. The mission of A Pillar for Women, og Kvinner på Sokkel i Bergen, is to right the lack of representation of memorials to women in the public space. The task of carrying out the first sculpture was set to an art committee consisting of Maja Økland, Kiyoshi Yamamoto, Hanna Gillov Kloster, Trine Lise Nedreås, and Svein Petter Kveim. The committee set up the following ambitions. In addition to being a woman, the person and position of Kim Friele represents gay rights, controversy, tenacity, and accomplishments. A sculpture dedicated to Kim Friele is therefore a symbol for equality, human rights, and democracy, which shows Bergen and its inhabitants as forward-thinking and inclusive. The art committee considered it particularly important to identify a central and highly visible location in downtown Bergen. In addition, the artwork should be of the highest international standard and quality and exemplary for our time in its artistic expression. Public sculpture in the heart of a city interacts with all of the city's inhabitants. Therefore, it was important to have a clear and precise presentation of the project throughout the entire process. The committee wanted the more controversial and ambivalent sides of Friele's position to be interpreted both artistically and through public dialogue, and strived to make a solid and well-founded, but also brave and unconventional choice inspired by Friele. The project accepted open pre-qualifying submissions and received 52 applicants, followed by a closed competition with 6 invited artists, finally selecting Lina Viste Grønli's concept. A sculpture in the form of 3 benches that spells out the letters K-I-M, monumental in their size, with 3 meters length and 1 to 3 meters width, intended to be used. The benches would carry a sign confirming the work's title and purpose. The title of the artwork, Benches for Kim, refers to the anecdote of a young Kim Friele sitting on a bench in Oslo, scouting for gay people after she had recently come out of the closet from heterosexual marriage. The artist intended to create a meeting place that invited interaction and socialization, as well as reflection and contemplation. The benches were proposed to be made in traditional sustainable materials and with a simple design, functional for everyone. The art committee's response was, and I quote in part, Bergen Kommune's first contribution to A Pillar for Women will be a place that turns hierarchies upside down and puts the public on the pillar. Here, anyone who wants may throw an R. Kim and remember her persistent work for gay equality on which we all rest. As a representative of the gay movement, this is a monument that goes its own way and chooses community over authority. Kim Friele is a true Bergener, and as such, this sculpture is taking up a lot of space and shouts out her name loudly. Congratulations to Kim Friele. It was also important for the art committee that the benches were thoroughly promoted, and in response, Maja Økland has curated a program of performances during Bergen Pride in order to activate the benches and make sure its core audiences become aware of them. The program will happen on the benches or by the benches and can be followed from inside the Pride House. Today, June 5th at 7:30 p.m., Kiyoshi Yamamoto and Nayara Leite. Thursday, 10th of June at 6 p.m., Lynn Cecilie Ulvin. And finally, Saturday, 12th June at 11 a.m., Nils Beck. And these performances become, in my opinion, important historical moments that we need to preserve for the future. And they might also generate further artistic or other actions. Thank you, and happy Pride.
Hallo. So, hello. Can you hear me? I hate speaking in the microphone. We don't do this when we do salons with Frank. I think I'll turn this back into something more conversational and a bit more informal, because I really do miss the salons that we started doing with Frank. Thank you so much for the generous invitation, Axel. So my name is Silje Storele, and I've been running Frank together with Liv Bugge since 2012. And as mentioned, we just ended Frank, and we, out of various reasons, I think we kind of, I spoke with Tine, this is a performance, Tine recently, and I said that we had retired, and I think there's something about the fact that I feel like we did a lot of things in Oslo and in Norway early on, and I see that things are changing, and now we can also go back to focus on our own practices a bit more. As mentioned, it started as a salon. This is one image of one of the spaces that we used frequently, which was Liv Bugge's apartment in Osterhaus gate, next to Kakadu, an area which has been heavily gentrified recently. I think this apartment has probably been, it was sold, it was a rental when she had it, and has been sold and probably divided into 3 apartments. So it had that kind of 1890s salon. It kind of allowed itself to host, I think we were probably 30, 40 people. The reason why we started a salon was that actually none of us knew each other. Synnøve, who was also part of it, Synnøve G. Vetten, knew Liv a bit, and then they met me, and I had returned from LA after doing my studies. I did my master's in LA, and then Liv had lived abroad, and we were 3 queers in Oslo that were like, what's going on? No one's really, like, we didn't have a scene, we didn't have like a discourse, we didn't have a proper meeting place, not a proper bar that worked for us. And we kind of have joked that, of course, it was the art that was driving the reasons for running Frank, or for starting it. It was showing art that we didn't see, and also creating the discourse to support it through informal meetings. But it was also, we kind of joked, it was a dating platform, which frequently worked quite well. But it was about the kind of intimacy and the kind of the intimate space of semi-private, or kind of, I think we were also terrible, like, this was like, I don't know if it was before Instagram, it was obviously before we were on Instagram. And it was just like, we had all these gatherings in places that were so much about not telling other people it was happening, and people had weird ways of getting there. I think maybe we didn't do... Is there... Okay. It's Mercury retrograde, so we'll... strømsparing, kanskje? Never. Okay. We'll see if this works. Yeah, so where were we? We spoke about the kind of intimacy of the place, and so it started as a salon. Later on, we kind of moved on to, I guess we kind of very quickly was given this position because we were some of the few, I mean, it's not like other people weren't working on queer history and showing queer works or queer art, but we were early on in the art scene, I think, and it was a very machismo moment, a very kind of strong brotherhood that was kind of at least at the Oslo art scene at the time. So we kind of was given this position to also represent the queer perspective. We were early on invited by Kunstnernes Hus. Mats Stjernström was there at the time to commemorate or react to the 40th anniversary, the Skeivt kulturår that no one marked. I think it was the 40th anniversary of the decriminalization of male homosexuality. Then we also responded, as mentioned by earlier here, at the 2013 anniversary of Stemmerettighetsjubileet. But our works and project took many forms. We also hosted a club together with, in relation to FET, the 10-year anniversary of FET, with Katarina and Mykke. We did the Potta. We did the remake of Potta at Maxi Taxi, which I think is now still kind of, I don't know, was anyone there? The people that were there remember it. It was a fun night. We published books and curated exhibition, but we also organized a lot of discussions. We ran a residency program. And then for some years now, we had decided to end it, but I think particularly for me, I knew what it means to run artist-runs initiatives and how easily they are forgotten and how they are easily remembered only by the people that were there. So I wanted to make an accessible archive, like a self-archive of everything we've done. In order also for us to see that everything we've done, because when you run an artist-run space or more of a kind of platform as we did, it's not like, it was always driven by urgency and necessity. We did what we needed to see, we did what we needed to feel and see happening. So it was a very kind of, we really reacted to a certain context rather than, it was a lot of, at the same time we started, Frank, a lot of other people started artist-run spaces, and we were certain that we didn't want to paint walls and had to pay the rent every month. So our projects took many forms, which I think in some times also maybe made us a bit inaccessible or hard to grasp. But I will read a part of the editor's note. One of the rewarding discoveries that came from editing this book was to see how coherent and consistent our process has been. People constantly asked us, what is Frank? The nomadic, collaborative, and fluid nature of Frank made it uncategorizable and confusing to those who looked for prepackaged answers. Despite the fact that our projects have taken many forms, it's evident that now that Frank has been a practice, a way of working with queer as something we do, not only something we are. A form of questioning that weaves the project together, regardless of location or role moving through the past and the future. So, there are some free postcards for you here. The book was launched at virtually at the Printed Matters Virtual Art Book Fair in February, as mentioned. The postcards are a remake of postcards we made for the one show at in 2014, and it has a little note here. For the 2014 exhibition Marie Hög Meets Clara Lidén, curated by Frank at One Archives in Los Angeles, we created postcards like this, the one you hold in your hand. They ended up on friends' fridges, bedroom walls, and desks at work. Back in Los Angeles months later, Silla was approached by a stranger. Every person I've had sex with since that show has had that postcard up on their wall. So now you can also have this postcard up on your wall. And I'm very happy that Maria Hög can be a witness to all that's happening in your private spaces. So I wanted to show you a video that we made. This is like not working. I wanted to show a video that we made, or I made together with Istan Virag, because I think one of the kind of the power of Frank and like why we thought it was fun was the meeting between people and the kind of the intimacy of that meeting. I think it's been very hard for me to be enjoying meeting people, teaching and so on, and not being able to kind of have that kind of in-person meeting. So I wanted to try to translate the book and like what Frank is to in a virtual form, or like in a video work, or a video that would give you the book. So I will now screen this video. This is your cue, tech guy.
We have worked from an interest in locating queerness in history, genealogy, political movements, and notions of time. Can you say something about how these interests have formed our working methods?
Looking back at our work in its totality, I believe Frank's way of approaching queerness as a tool has been most apparent in our work on history. The way we quite instinctively refuse to historicize in a linear fashion. To not say from year X to year Y this happened, but to juxtapose the now and then without reducing them to past and present. To make unlikely connections. Personally, I think this has been our strength, or at least definitely what I've found most interesting in working together with you. We've trusted the audience's own interpretations without moralizing or guiding them too much. But this method of work is also what has made Frank difficult to pin down for others. Many have looked for answers we would not single-handedly provide. Artist-run initiatives have a tendency to come and go, and they are often seen as most important in the immediate context in which they operate. Frank has been working extensively with history and the writing of histories. From your standpoint, do you think Frank will be legible, interesting, and important for people in the future?
I think Frank will be important for the future Franks. By that I mean people like ourselves, searching for a history and related practices that had a life before them. And alongside our narrative also comes the history of the others before and around us. I guess the lifespan of initiatives such as ours creates a particular urgency, but like with many of the things we've been working on, this urgency changes and comes back in other forms. And I think this is where a document of a certain practice at a certain moment is important for others in the future to look and relate to. If there is no documentation or archive, the life of artist-run initiatives and the urgency of certain practices are very likely to get lost or forgotten in the writing of history. I like to think that this book will become gradually more important as time passes.
I found a family. My family are people who have not been normalized, who stand for who they are, who question or are questioned continuously about their desires. This is another note I found in my scribbles on some other page. I can't trace when or where I was when I wrote it, but I do feel a strong connection with it. I feel these words are as true as a general statement as they are in specific reference to Frank and to my connection to them. The allegiance I feel with their work. It is an unorthodox family, one that comes together in the same house, not through relations of blood, DNA, or imposed genealogical lineage, like a tree with roots and determined growth, but rather through a rhizomatic concatenation of belonging, of bodies converging on a path they share provisionally for a time. Frank is the subject and object of political dissidence, of collective existence, of an enunciation that brings about self-consciousness to understand a collective unconscious, a we expressing light and darkness, self and other, solitude and solidarity, a chain of bodies transferring knowledge on behalf of the ones who cannot otherwise do it. They share a path for a time, trembling together.
Kjære Frank, takk for at vi fikk en romanse. Romanser er forutbestemt til å feile, dø, eventuelt gjenoppstå som noe annet. For meg, som er en god del eldre enn deg, Frank, var en late romance en vidunderlig avveksling fra tingenes, ærlig talt, bedrøvelige tilstand. Du, Frank, dukket plutselig opp, midt i samtidens og kunstens høyrepopulistiske, antifeministiske, klimakrisefornektende, høyglansproduksjon samt kropps- og sexkult som har fått alle tenkelige subjektposisjoner til å implodere i en slags post-internettid, der det ikke finnes noen utside eller outsidere, noen motkulturer, noen subkulturer lenger. Det er en stakkars middelaldrende, og vel så det, postklimakteriell, skeiv romantiker som meg skulle kunne søke tilflukt og kanskje møte andre som ikke har lyst på kapitalismen. Men så kom du, Frank, elskede Frank. Det å feile og mislykkes, som er livets og kunstens lykke, er i dag bare ok så lenge mislykketheten handler om de andre. De mindre begavede, flittige, disiplinerte, tilpassede, de som er mindre på nett eller ser mindre bra ut med mere. Men så kom du, Frank, og elskede deg. Du fikk meg og andre du hadde romanser med, for du hadde visst mange. Du fikk oss til å fatte håp. Med ett var det rom for å snakke om motsetninger, om uutholdeligheter i, hva skal vi kalle det for tiden, postkapitalismen, som utageres i og gjennom kroppene, overtøyde kropper, hysteriske kropper, gamle kropper, kroppsproteser, virusbefengte kropper, inderlig omslyngede eller aggressivt kjempende kroppsklumper. Fremfor alt var det mulig å snakke om mislykkethetens eksistensialitet, estetikk og politikk med deg, Frank. Nå som det er slutt mellom oss, eller er det snarere en overgang til noe annet, kan jeg endelig si det jeg var for blyg til å uttale høyt. Jeg elsker deg, Frank.
Thank you. So I actually forgot to mention that we were invited to do to be in the competition for the monument for Kim Friele as well, but due to COVID and logistics, it became impossible. I was in New York during a residency, and Liv was in Oslo, and yeah, we didn't have the chance to go to Bergen and so on. But so I also started thinking a lot about like how do you memorialize Kim Friele, who's alive in a city, and also next to other very big pieces of art. There's a big Magne Furuholmen piece and another very phallic sculpture. So I was kind of, we were working through also thinking around the bench. It would have looked a bit differently if we did it, but yeah, I'm happy that the bench was brought in and that it was so anti-monumental. In a way. And I think there's something to that which has to do with our strategy, which maybe is where I think we're queer. It's this way of attempting to change the structures that we're forced to fit into and that are normatively like conditioning us in certain ways. So so you, in one way, I'm happy that the project didn't didn't have a pedestal and replaced it with a woman on top, even though, yeah. So I was thinking about in terms of how to explain, because often I think people are like, it's easy to understand feminism, what does queerness means, and often queerness is reduced, I think, to sexual identity, which to me, and I've tried to express this also in what I read before, is like it's a methodology as well, or a way of approaching something. And I think in one way that's also how I wanted to kind of go on with this presentation and speak briefly about how I built up the structure around the book, because there's something about linearity and the wish or the drive to also break up sort of linear notions of progress and time. So the book, I'll try to do it in a smooth way. It will probably be very confusing, but it has 3 different sections. Each section is divided by a silk screen, and it's divided by a text that explains each part. The first part, and I'll read a bit from each intersection, is called Temple of Friendship. The Temple of Friendship, a small Doric temple in Natalie Clifford Barney's Parisian garden, was an early inspiration for Frank. For 60 years, Barney hosted a female-centered literary salon at Rue Jacob. In imagining the Sapphic gatherings, these intimate meetings of bodies and conversations, we saw our own need to create a space that could generate a community focusing on gender, desire, and sexuality through art. Temple of Friendship, the first part of this book, embraced the early days of Frank and the urgency that fueled our fire. Yeah, so this part of the book has some kind of, we ask people to just share their memories of these their early kind of encounters with Frank. I found old emails, one of them by Katarina Bonnevier, that emailed the group after we had spent 10 days at the Skomvær, outside of Røst, an artist residency in like the very west part of Lofoten. It also has 2 essays. One of them was in the video, one by Antonio Cataldo, who was a very frequent visitor to our salons. He kind of recollects his way of his memories of the salon, and then we have Fredrik Svensk, who's a Swedish writer who writes about the salon without ever having participated. The second part, this is Katarina's text. The second part is called Genealogies. I'll read a part of that as well. Frank was a response to the void that we experienced, a lack of archives and narratives, including ancestors of queer and feminist struggles. With Frank, we were invested in tracing lineages, finding friends from the past, attempting to make the past present. The second part of this book is dedicated to genealogies, our work engaging with history in non-linear ways. Genealogies documents how Frank has worked with queerness as a methodology, leaving narratives of progress behind. This image is from the excavation of the Oseberg ship, which, interestingly, I mean, what they believe they found, these men and other male archaeologists, was Queen Åsa. But we were interested in these like modern, or the contemporary archaeologists who's questioning whether or not this was a vulva. So a vulva who lived like in like past pagan society outside of like heterosexual gender norms, and which was a kind of a mythic figure, which also had a lot of power and wasn't a queen because she was kind of married to a king. The third part is dealing with power. The final part of this book is dedicated to power, the power that Frank generated and experienced with our collaborators. This section is also about urgency and the continuous process of reorienting ourselves in relation to that sense of urgency. One of these realignments was a shift from representation to production. That is to say, we became increasingly interested in the artistic processes behind the works we showed. The Frank Salon left its initial domestic realm and became public at Kunstnernes Hus Cinema in Oslo with the series Moving Images, Moving Politics, focusing on the work, on the working methods of the artists, producers, and filmmakers in our network and whose work we screened. And I think this is a very important shift. Also in terms of thinking of representation, because I don't think representation is enough. I think you really need to change the very structures that is producing whatever you're producing. And I think in one way, or Siri Hjorten Wagner, who's a Swedish producer, says it really well. It's like, it's not enough to put a person of color in front of the camera. You need to really change everything about that production. You need to change like who's making the film, like what is the content of the film? What is like, how is it being made? What are the power structures of that production? So I think this was an interesting discovery for us because we kind of started working from the lack of representation and increasingly became interested in how do we make our own work and how can we change those structures that are like underlying for how we're coming to what we're coming to. And then in one way also confusing to people because we're like, oh yeah, but isn't that a straight man you're screening? Yes, it's a straight man, but he has a very queer way of producing his work, or like even just going into questions of how people make work, not only what are you showing. When I think throughout the book there's a lot of conversations because that's been important to us the entire time, and we also kind of transcribed conversations we've had before with people, but then also we engaged in new conversations. Some of them with Eline Mugås and Elise Storsven, who we've worked parallel to, and also with Ruben Steinem, who's now the head of NBK, who used to be the head of, the styreleder at the UKS. So, am I okay with time? So I'll finish with one kind of project, which is what I also described earlier on, Postscript on or Curing Normality, which was our response to the Skeivt Kulturår that no one celebrated 10 years ago. I am always questioning, like, why now? Why? What are the like forces at play that wants us to remember now? What makes that possible? Who are those institutions? Is it just because of this chunk of money that's coming in? What are your intentions? All these things. Because we were, I mean, also we didn't come up with this, and like we didn't come up with, our response was an invitation by Mats Stjernstedt. But I wanted to kind of think about this a little bit with you, because in terms of what we're trying to address today, which is about representation and public space, we did this talk, or we did this series, which was called Curing Normality, and we had Amal Aden, we had Espen Ester Pirelli Benstad, we had Jessica Gissel from your favorite queer magazine, and who was the last person? Geir Brandberg, of course, how could I forget, who recalled watching The Children's Hour, which I think is like a 1967 film, and with Shirley MacLaine and Audrey Hepburn, which has this like kind of lesbian undertone. So we wanted to kind of publish her essay, which she presented, which is also quite controversial. She's like, queers or like gay people shouldn't have the right to access like reproductive rights. That's like a private matter. You can fix that in other ways. The state shouldn't be involved. Like quite radical things that we don't necessarily agree with, but we thought it was very important to also share that and to give like her talk a physical form in the form of a printed matter. But one of the things that we kind of felt was difficult was how do we represent that queer life that she's describing? And as mentioned before, there was no queer archive. And I kind of, editing this book, I also realized that in this publication, we really didn't discuss the fact that how we found the images we found and so on. So we wrote a short text just kind of recalling this actual lack of archives. So I'll read that and then open it up. Looking for traces of ancient monuments. As a way of giving an afterlife to the film program and speaker series Curing Normality, which we organized at Kunstnernes Hus, Oslo in 2012, we made the publication postscript on Curing Normality. As part of this process, we asked ourselves what kind of photographs can represent queer life forced to be lived in secrecy? Which stories and bodily traces are hidden in the streets we walk and the buildings that surround us? What kind of architecture holds your desire when your desire is deemed illegal? The search for visual material for the publication proved challenging, not only because the fact that if you live a life the life you live is criminalized by law, you rarely document it, but also because there was no national queer archive at the time we started to work on this publication. So there's a footnote here. Skeivt Arkiv, the Norwegian queer archive in Bergen, was established and developed in the years 2012 to 2015. So this was around the same time as Skeivt Arkiv was developed. Before the 1974 opening of Metropol, an Oslo club and café run by the first Norwegian gay and lesbian organization, Det Norske Forbundet av 1948. Queer life was restricted to being lived within private homes and in spaces where code names needed to be used. Queers in Oslo and its surroundings met at the now torn-down Ormsund Rowing Club, the Snarøya Sports Club, and various public cruising spots. With the help of our friend, the author Ylva Wernskjold, we searched rather randomly through private archives we had access to, such as that of the feminist writer Geir Brandberg. Surprisingly, we found a substantial amount of material in Norsk Folkemuseum's photo archives. At this point, it seemed like a lot of information and history was about to get lost due to an aging generation. We ended up finding a wide variety of images of various queer meeting places from different time periods. To this day, we only know, to a certain degree, what the images are showing, who is in them, what the people are doing, who took them, and when they are taken. But we have attempted to give the most accurate description we could in postscript on Curing Normality. Many of the images depict public spaces, such as the public urinal and cruising spot at Kampen, tagged with graffiti that reads Fortidsminne, translated into ancient monument. Other images show the wall of a square with the graffiti Analbule, translated into anal den, and Soper Roar Krogs plass, translated into Faggot Roar Krogs plass. Another shows people standing in a line masked for what seems like a costume party, an image we believe was taken outside of Bar Lambda in Oslo. Other images included in the publication showed crop bodies dancing at Metropol and a group of naked bodies interwoven at what might be Hercules sauna. Finding these images was important for us as a way to attempt to keep alive multiple histories of queer life, even if a lot of the factual information might have already been lost. Yeah, I think that was all I had to say.
Just going to do a little bit of a technical switch over. I'm sorry, I'm too eager.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, you can actually see the stage from where I am sitting in a web camera. So if you want to, I see your backs, so to speak. So Björn, did you want to go first? Okay, so good afternoon. I'm calling in from my heartland in Sankt Anna, Sweden. And I'm super happy to be here. And thank you so much for those two beautiful presentations that have already been here. My name is Katarina Bonnevier, and I'm part of the group Mycket. And I'm so happy to meet you in this way and temporarily join PAC here today in this kind of mismatching queer seminar with the ghostly online presence over here and then the weighty corporeal presences. A seminar about more or less steady places. What I will do is that I'm going to take you on a kind of field trip through the momentary fast plus fixed places of Mycket. Through our lavender heartlands, roaming a queer field of places, architectures and memory constructions. And in these heartlands that we roam, normative orders such as the division between the rural and the urban, the domestic and the public, cease to make sense. I have brought a small, I'm sitting here in my heartland, and to some, I know Silly has been here, to some people this place is part of the Lesbian Valley. And it's a nice story about the Lesbian Valley because I think at one point we started to jokingly call it that, my friends and I who moved here. And then after a while this name came back to us and people were like, I bumped into someone and it's like, oh, where do you have your house? Is that right? In the Lesbian Valley. So this name has started to live its own life. And even though it might be a lesbian valley, there are lots of different kinds of queers here that might think about themselves as some politically lesbian, I would say. I'm also really happy that this seminar is part of Bergen Pride, which also means that I'm playing a small part in Bergen Pride. And I wish I really could be there with my own body present with all its nasty bits and pieces, but you have to bear with me like this. I'm really honored and it's a pleasure for me to be here to talk about these topics because they are really the sources for and the passions in my work as an architect, artist and researcher. that is the queer public spaces in relation to memories and representation. So I'm an architect and researcher, and as was mentioned in the introduction earlier, I have a PhD in my back pocket called Behind Straight Curtains Towards a Queer Feminist Theory of Architecture that came out in 2007. And, you know, it's such an endeavor to write a PhD, and then this feedback that I constantly keep on getting from that work is so rewarding. Like today, when it just dawns on me about the story about the small temple, La Temple de l'Amitié, that Sille talked about, that Natalie Barney had, which was a major part of the PhD, and that construction of the salon, and how the salon became a kind of motor for a lesbian avant-garde in the early 20th century Paris, but how that avant-garde situation has been continued into the queerness of the Oslo salons of Frank in the early 21st century. Mick and I, we've just recently also published this magazine. I hope you can see. Well, I'll back it up. Do you see? Yeah, now I guess you see it. So this is the best queer cultural journal, or that got presented earlier on as well, Girls Like Us. And Mikke was proud to be invited to guest edit it, because they were interested in having an issue that related to queer spaces and queer design and what that could mean. And we were interested in creating an archive that relates to a 9-year artistic research project that we've been doing called the Club Scene. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this guest issue of Girls Like Us, in it we have tried to take the reader, it's like a performance in writing, and we've tried to take the reader on a tour through the queer lesbian feminist clubs that we created in this project. So it's written like a theatrical manuscript. And hopefully that will kind of stage the clubs for you. With me here also I have this tiny amulet that you see on the screen. It is part of the recent artistic research project that we have entered into called Troll Perceptions in the Heartland. And here we challenge our troll perception. We start out of our inner changelings, that piece of us that I guess as a queer person I always thought about as a kind of this queer or as a scave way of relating to normative society, and have we started to think about ourselves as a kind of changelings in this society. And we're thinking that if we depart from this position of the changeling, which we believe is a kind of queer position, that we could possibly get beyond what we already know. So it's a method of going beyond. It's a kind of anticipatory studies via artistic research. And this project is very much in its start, so we haven't gone so far yet, but I've been starting to study charms, amulets, tokens, and so on as a kind of magic potion that could help us get our troll perception going. So this first amulet that I do is also actually it's made out of things that I found here around, lying in the Lesbian Valley. It's plastic from the agriculture. This plastic foil that you need for growing things, and there's a little bone from the wild boars some wild boar that had died in the forests underneath here, and then there is some silk threads and the feathers of the chest of a duck that I've found in the forest as well. But of course, this is also my angel poodle. That is one of the companions that I keep my life together with, the little poodle Tia. So she will, since you are a great group there, I thought I also had to, bring along some of my pack. But now I'm going to share screen, so you'll see a little bit more of the pack with which I'm usually roaming. So bear with me while I start sharing screen. So, do you see my screen now? I can't hear you, so someone needs to put down the mic and just answer, because I only see my own screen right now.
It's working.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so this is one of the packs that I've been roaming with. And the two other persons of Mycket that I'm collaborating with, it's Mariana da Silva and Therese Kristiansson, to the far right on this picture. Here on the picture you also see some of the dancers of Mixed Dancers Academy and Ros Akdogan. And when Mycket is doing projects, we are often engaged in large networks of people. And when we were creating this dance place called the Ball Cap on Råslätt outside Jönköping, we collaborated with the dance group Mixed Dancers. Mycket has been collaborating since 2012. And we have generated a broad range of outcomes, such as large-scale theatrical productions, permanent public spaces, costume details, art pieces, instruments, exhibitions, animations, performances, text and theory production, educations and lectures. And we share a common ground in a strive to practice out of a set of intersecting perspectives, such as queer, feminist, class-aware, anti-racist. And through our work, we try to develop a method to critique and construct at once. We dig into historical reference materials found in public and private archives, connect that to contemporary matters and conditions, invite participants with relevant experiences, and interpret all that to create a new situation. A situation which relies on a mass of references, but never tries to be a copy or a direct reenactment. Rather, we think about it as a kind of critical fiction. Mycket, we consider the normative, official, and legal writing of history inadequate. Therefore, we actively favor the construction of dreams and thought experiments, of make-believe and building of castles in the air. To quote one of our favorite queer theorists, Gloria Anzaldúa from 1987, "Nothing happens in the real world unless it first happens in the images in our heads." This is a quote from her book Borderlands. And the idea of the borderland is very foundational to our practice. It's that kind of space where we actually, or a kind of field where a lot of intersecting perspective crisscross and interact. And that's how we also think about queerness and the queer. It's the way I think about it, I ascribe to what Silje just said, that queer is something we do. Queer is something situated, and queer is an action in place. For us, resistance against ignorance, violence and destruction, and a hope for a better future for all of us is awakened when we encounter adults who play, who take their desires seriously. What we build together is a future of equality, respect and diversity, a life practice of continued artistic research. And right now we're kind of imagining ourselves on the verge of developing aesthetic and ethic expressions beyond modernist and patriarchal constraints. I guess for the ones of you who speak Norwegian, you might understand the word mycket, but I think it also could need a translation. In English, it means much, and that is what we do. We do a lot. And that also reflects how we look at various aesthetic and ethic expressions. The three of us came together after a decade-long involvement in critical theory. Our long-standing interaction with students had pointed us towards an absence in the field of gender and space. We came together to show, not only to tell, what the spatial, embodied and material artistic practice engaged with queer theory could achieve on a discursive, reflective, as well as hands-on material levels. We departed from these insights in the artistic research project called the Club Scene. And this image is from our survey of the queer, lesbian, feminist clubs that we found during a time period in Gothenburg on the west coast of Sweden. So we made a huge survey, a huge call to see how many queer clubs we could find during this time period. And of course, the club is a very, I mean, even though it might be a super ephemeral space, some clubs only existed for one night. There are still spaces, there are still architectures which might transform or enable people's lives. The queer club might be the only place like home, the only place where you can actually act out of your own desires and your own wishes. And so we made this map of Gothenburg, and it's a map which you actually can, of course, navigate. You can use this map to navigate Gothenburg. You might get lost, but that might also be a point for it. And from this mapping, we created a carnival, which we called Exclude Me In. For the carnival, we created more than 200 costumes or pieces that could be used as costumes. And you see these banners on the image. And then we made a carnival float from Esperantoplatsen, where one of the important clubs in Gothenburg had taken place, called Touch. Which also had a lot of hate crimes directed towards it, and it ended in a contemporary club, and the smoky kind of picture in the back is where just outside that contemporary club. At that time, I think it had also a lot of different names, but I think that time it was Slap the Pony. And what we realized with this, so the Club Scene project, what we did was try to, in different ways, stage the clubs again, to reactivate the history of the club, and do it in full scale so that contemporary people or creatures of our time could enter into the club and get an experience of it. So that's like the background mythology of the clubs. And we created all the things for this enactment in the sawmill, and this is the group the most central group of creators for the Gothenburg club, the Exclude Me In Carnival, and as you see, this was the thank you card that we sent out afterwards to all the others that had also been participating in the project. And of course, for us, it was super obvious that this barn was central to the project, because in this barn we had made this kind of live for 3 weeks when we created everything together. And I'll show you some pictures from that's the outside of the barn, and some pictures of from when we used it as a studio space. The barn is here in the Lesbian Valley, and it has been a super important support structure for Mycket since we got it. We share this barn with 8 other people, so it's a small collective space. But we also realized that what we've been doing quite a lot is that we've been producing our art, our pieces, our clubs in a rural community, but then we've always taken them to an urban place. So it's very much like we have been colonizing the rural, and And we've been doing exactly the same as we critique, other people for doing. That we go to the countryside, we take all the production facilities that we have here, and then we just put the artwork in the urban community again. And we are quite critical to that idea that queerness only exists in urbanity. But then again, we've been ourselves playing in and doing and contributing to that misunderstanding, even though since we moved here to the Lesbian Valley, we have just actually only found solidarity. And of course, we were not even the only queer in the valley once we moved, at first when we moved here either. So all these ideas about moving between the rural and urban. I'm just going through all these ideas really quickly now. But anyway, so this is also background for the artistic project we're doing right now. We've been trying to see, but how can we create art and architecture that actually stays within the local community, that also contributes even more to a local presence here in Sankt Anna. So this is one of the backgrounds to the project we're doing now. Now I'm going to move much closer to you. We're moving into Oslo. And Silje already mentioned that we did a project together based on the Potpurriet. The club that we created together with Frank, we called Harder, Better, Faster, Stronger. And it was the club scene Act 7 in 2014. And to create this club, we went to look at the archives, and here are some snapshots from the archives. And the original Potpurri was created by Sissel Hansen and Marianne Larsen. And it was, reading back on this, of course, they tell a lot about the times of the 1990s. And it was also fantastic to see how important and significant this club was. And one of the reasons why we choose to make a full-scale kind of reenactment of Potpurriet was that it was one of the few clubs that also held a super queer potential in it, in the fact that it was one of the few clubs, or maybe the only, you can correct me on this, a club that was open after 1 o'clock in the night in Oslo at the time. So when the other straight clubs closed, everyone came to Potta. And so after 1 o'clock in the night, it became super queer. You had this kind of crisscrossing of class, of gender, of in one place, and different kinds of desires and so on, mixing in one space. So we thought it was super interesting to try to see if we could create a fantasy of what it had been like to be in Potpurriet. And when we did this restaging, we never tried to make a copy, because we thought that wouldn't be interesting, to try to make a replica out of a pre-existing place. But rather we tried to see if we could capture the atmosphere, the way that it was staged, tried to find some important instances. And here's one of the things that we found from Potta that triggered our imagination was the performance by Linn Cecilie Ulvin, who was doing this topless boxing performance at the original Potta. So we created this topless costumes. I was a bit too shy to be actually topless, so we had this papier-mâché titties, so that you can see on the left hand, and I never looked better, I think. And we did we did create this club together with Frank, as I said, but also we had lots of really beautiful stylistas who helped us with the club. It was Kusugi Daisuke, Ina Hagen, Kajsa Dahlberg, Goro Tronsmo, Brynja Brandlien, the collective Kuk, DJ Ingebling, DJ Collective, Too Many Girls, and I already mentioned Linn Cecilie Ulvin. And also Reidar Engesbakk was very important for the research that we did to create this club. One of the backgrounds to the Club Scene project is the idea that the party is political, and that these spaces they are momentary. They exist in a certain place with a certain crowd during a certain time. Nevertheless, they can create embodied spatial experiences of belonging that lingers in its participants forever. And what's more important, they can also be awakened to take place again. They are also situations where boundaries between the staged and the real are touched upon, where fiction, myth, expectation cannot be separated from reality. And we did 13 different acts, and spatially they range from a super secret club held in a private apartment to a kind of hyper-visible nightclub. This is a very fully public project that we created for the Stockholm Cultural Festival in 2018. It's a project called Kämpaåke. It could be translated into English as Strugglioke. So it's a karaoke bar with songs that care. So we collected an archive of songs that have been important in various political struggles across several cultures and across the globe. And we tried to be as broad as possible, but of course what the collection of songs depended on who we were able to reach out to and who responded to our call. This, let's see, so here are some images from when it actually took place. And this is a queer space in the queers of senses, that it has to do with politics, it has to do with a shared space, it has to do with desire, it has to do with a crisscrossing of an enormous amount of various identity perspectives. And it was I think the most public space we ever created, because during the Stockholm Culture Festival that summer in August, which we of course longed for because we were so close and there was so much sweat and people could be near to each other at that time. But anyway, at that particular time, which seems like a utopian space right now in this pandemic, it was exceedingly public, but it was not... it caused quite a lot of disturbance, and there was lots of debate about it, because we put up all these banners with slogans, and we decided that we would not censor banners that we might not stand for, but other than we did not want to have any banners that had a kind of threat in them. A threat of violence, because we haven't had enough of hate crimes. But for instance, this banner, "No master, no slave," to some people that became a threat. So of course, even though we thought that wasn't very threatening, that actually was the one who caused the most disturbance, which also relates to a topic brought up earlier today with the Black Lives Matter rising. Let's see, how am I doing time-wise? I have a few more minutes. Okay, I'll go through our projects a bit faster. So here you see how that little how it kind of glowed just in front of the big box of the Royal Castle in Stockholm, at least momentarily, creating a completely different atmosphere in that space there. And this is the Castle in the Air project that we have created out of trash, where everything that can hold air. And we've been doing this project in large sewing circles. And this method we've been using, we call it DIG, dig, which means doing in group rather than DIY, do it yourself. And this explains a kind of didactic attitude that we have in our practice. We established the prerequisites for shared material creation, where everyone's contribution can be seen in individual detail and as part of combined appearance. In the beginning, no one knows how it will turn out. It's a shared process of investigation through materialization. So we first developed this method in this project, the Luftslott, dream castles or castles in the air. And we have continued doing this DIG method when we transformed a pedestrian tunnel in Haninge to the Grotto of the Naiads, together with local artists, and when we've been working on Råslätt, where we first started to transform that boring festive place. You know, this was supposed to be the place where this would be the most fun place on Råslätt, and you see how terrible it looked. So we decided to transform it with color. And we invited everyone who lives on Råslätt in this district of Jönköping to participate in redecorating it. And the ones who joined were young, and we had a great 2 days in redecorating it. And it became a kind of memorial of the buildings of Råslätt. We used the same color palette, as you can see on the buildings behind this 1960s Million Program project. And right now they are redecorating the facades of the Million Program, but the decorations we done for the stage box will stay. So that will be then a memento of the 1990s decorations, artistic decorations of Råslätt. And this method, we introduced it on Råslätt, and what was really fun was that the tenant organization took it up, and they continue doing this kind of DIGs together with people on Råslätt, and have redecorated many places on Råslätt after this. And then we created this, the CAP. And the CAP is a place for dance and music where you can play your own soundtrack from your smartphone into really, really good sound system that sits inside the roof of this CAP. And the floor is really good for dancing, and it's a truly also public space in the sense that it doesn't have any walls. You can roll onto it with a stroller or a wheelchair. And it's also used for dance classes for Mixed Dancers Academy. And fortunately, this was also a really good place for the pandemic. So it was inaugurated last year, and it's been possible to use it all year. So it was in good timing for the pandemic. And here you can see how we've been kind of collaborating with youngsters here in Råslätt as well for this project. Okay, so that's the CAP. And this is my final picture. I just wanted to bring you back again to the Lesbian Valley and the Troll Perception in the Heartland project, which I'm working with right now. And here are some of the trolls that I have encountered in the forest so far. Thank you. So I stop my screen sharing now.
Okay. Let's see, I think you need to... I've got the... Yeah. There we are. Thank you for inviting me, and I hope you all have some patience left. It's always a challenge to be the last one, but I hope I'm going to keep you interested for this presentation. Let's see. There we are. I was very glad that this could be done in English because, you know, at university we have these standardized PowerPoint presentations with the logo and the title. So, you know, in English it just looks a little bit more impressive. Senior Executive Officer, who knows what that is? But that's me. So I was asked on behalf of Skeivt Arkiv to reflect a little bit on archiving testimonials and personal histories. And I've been working at the archives since 2017. We are situated at Høyden, for those of you familiar with Bergen, where we are also a part of the university. In normal times, pre and post-COVID, we are also open to the public. And my current focus at the archives is communication and public outreach, as well as creating articles based on findings in the archives or specific events, like today. But from 2017 to 2020, I oversaw the archival oral collection of interviews from queer people from all over Norway. And in that period of time, we managed to collect about 200 different interviews with people from all over the country. Now, we'll get to the interviews in a moment. But I just want to give you a quick ABC of the archives for those of you who may never have heard of us. So the main task for the Queer Archives is to preserve, document, and present the queer history of Norway. And this is a photo from our basement, where we can see several of the archives, both from individuals and organizations. And as of now, we have about 490 meters of archival material, and this is divided between 144 different archives. We're also collecting what is to be Norway's biggest collection of queer books. So will also be available as a part of the library. Another thing we have is queer magazines. And we have the largest collection in Norway of this kind. Mostly Norwegian, but also some international. And to have their own printed material was of huge importance to the queer movement. The contents of the magazines could be decided by themselves, and very often in stark contrast to the traditional media publicizing almost entirely negative and angled attacks on the queer population, often sensationalized. And traditional media would usually focus on an imagined predatory behavior among gay men towards innocent youth, or AIDS scares, etc. So for very many people, these printed publications were a lifeline to keep you floating, as in, you are not alone. And there's also a huge collection of posters, which is very different, but still an important source of information. Here we can have a look at how did the queer organizations communicate themselves? How was the shock value? How did they reach out to their own? And not at least, how did they deal with communicating measures to handle the devastating AIDS pandemic? When most of Norway was also looking the other way. So this is material which may also contribute to enhance the personal stories we are here to talk about today. So we have, as I mentioned earlier, built up a collection, about 200 video interviews that document the lives of people who have been associated with LGBTQ+ organizations, or can in other ways speak about living outside the heteronormative way of life. It's not just about sexuality, as was mentioned earlier here. We also collect written stories, stories that people can write anonymously on our webpage. And also on our webpage we have the Skeivopedia, which is regularly updated with new articles on our findings and also on things connected to these interviews. We have interviewed people from all walks of life. Even our current Minister of Health, Bent Høie, accepted our request. And of course, the project had a natural stop in 2020 due to the pandemic. But up until then, we had a rather active period collecting interviews. I work closely with my colleague Jo Gjelle. He oversees the filming and editing, and I perform the interviews and take care of all the communication with the people being interviewed from beginning to end. And that is also a process of building trust, getting them to accept you, coming into their life, and all of this. And here we are at Geilo having a talk with Kim Friele, which has also been mentioned earlier today. She is a person we've actually done a few interviews with, just not the one, since she's had such a central position in this story. So most of our interviews are available for viewing at our library, and short clips from them are also available online to give you an idea of what we have on offer. Now, some of the interviews are only available for research or scientists. And this is an option we give everyone who's asked for an interview, that they can themselves decide how this should be available. And we also have, by now, a very small number who have also requested that their interviews will only be available after they are dead. Now, when it comes to the viewing options, the pandemic has clearly demonstrated how impractical it is that you have to come to our library to watch this. So I have a plan or a dream, call it what you like, that within the university sector and also in the educational system, that in a short time we will get what you can call a secure viewing option online. So, which means if you're at the university in Trondheim or wherever, you can have a look at the interviews without actually taking the trip. And that, I mean, technically that's not a very difficult thing to get to be done. So we're hoping for that. And now another very important thing is selection. We are aiming to get as much diversity as possible among the interviewees, concerning sex, gender, ethnical and sociocultural background. Now, Norway is interesting in that respect. Norway has historically been one of the most homogeneous societies in the world. At the beginning of the 70s, there were less than 1,000 non-Western immigrants in Norway. And this changed only in 1971, when the Norwegian government invited 600 Pakistani men to come and work due to the lack of skilled labor in our country. And then in the 80s came the first asylum seekers. In 1983, only 150 arrived. The year after, 300, and 3 years after that, again, about 9,000. And this fact we can also recognize in the group of people we have been interviewing so far, in that we wanted to get the eldest first, while they were still available. That is why, as of now, we have a majority of elderly white people in our catalogue. The biggest group being elderly gay men, the second biggest group, elderly lesbian women. But we are acutely aware of our responsibility, and we have also made a special point or an effort to do interviews within the trans community, for example. We are also in touch with groups like Skeiv Verden, a group for LGBTQ+ immigrants and other with minority backgrounds, and they also have quite an active group here in Bergen. And I've been to one of their events and had a presentation on the archives and looking for interviewees. But it's a fact that it's a more challenging contingency to get access to, for many reasons. The way we have gotten in touch with people is just by giving them a phone call. You know, Norway is a small country. Most of the people we are addressing within this community know of each other, know of us, maybe someone else who they know have also been interviewed. And this had been an advantage, obviously. I have an interesting anecdote on that too. So far, in 2 cases, people have rejected our request for an interview because they were only queer in the 70s and then only due to political reasons. It's very interesting. When it comes to a venue, preferably we would like to talk to people at home. Firstly, that is generally where most of us feel most relaxed. You also have a certain privacy, and you also have access to photos, objects, and other material that could jog your memory or bring out more information. Now, when it comes to the method, we have concluded that the practice of filming the interviews have many advantages. Along with what they're actually saying, you also get all the non-verbal communication, body language, mimicry, and presence. And also in the long-term run, it's interesting to hear how people talk about the queer issues, how they name things, like, say, in a 100-year perspective. It's an interesting thing to also get it on camera. We are also aware of the potential limitations a use of camera might be. Being filmed may affect the way you speak and what you choose to share. Another aspect might be that some people decline the request for an interview because of being filmed. However, so far, we have not encountered that as the reason for them turning us down. Now, oral history as a source for to be used, we have to remember it's a collection of subjective narratives. They give us an insight into how we construct our personal narratives, but it cannot alone be used as a historical source, because most of us remember a certain event differently. Interestingly, we forget most of the information just after something just has happened. For instance, I cannot recall the colors of the cars that passed on my way here today. Nevertheless, some things we do remember very well, and our brains save those memories correctly as they happen. And in addition to this, our own interpretation and analysis are stored quite quickly, and they last. If you interview people 2 months or 40 years after an important event in their lives, the difference in the versions will not necessarily be that huge. Another interesting thing that we found when doing these interviews, it's the narratives we have of telling our stories. Even though we aim for a very neutral and open approach to each of the interviews, we find that most people would start with their childhood, upbringing, the coming out phase, a period of oppression, and finally acceptance. And this is very definitely a cultural thing on how we tell a story. Now, I've also brought a few clips to show you. We have very many and versatile stories, but I just want to give you 3 short examples here. It's a collage from 3 different people. The first one talking about being trans, the second one talking a little bit about AIDS, and the third of being a queer parent. Let's see if we can get this working. Bummer. Skal vi se.
Jeg jobbet jo på Lillehammer i mange år på filmskolen der oppe før vi flyttet, eller før jeg begynte på masterutdannelsen her i Oslo. Og der var det, jeg husker det var en lørdag jeg gikk ut og følte jeg var veldig pent kledd, og så gikk jeg inn på en kafé og sitter der og drikker kaffe og spiser en kake. Og så på nabobordet kommer 4 av kollegene mine fra filmskolen og setter seg. Og jeg var jo liksom sånn, kjente at jeg var overlykkelig, for de kjente meg jo ikke igjen, liksom. Herregud, så deilig det var. Og så kommer jeg hjem etterpå, på leiligheten like etterpå, og så kjenner jeg bare at jeg er totalt tom innvendig. Jeg er syk. Det var akkurat som jeg var fylt av betong. Og så tenkte jeg, det var jo ikke sånn det skulle være. Det var nå jeg skulle snudd meg til de og sagt, hei, ser dere hvem jeg er? Og fra det øyeblikket så skjønte jeg at nå var jeg nødt til å snu flisa. Dette her var jo bare tull. Skulle resten av livet mitt bli sånn at det var lykkelig hvis det var ingen som kjente meg igjen? Og så tenkte jeg, det er jo helt feil.
Det var jo det som var det grusomme, hvis jeg skal si noe om det, i den helt første tiden, hvor det var den sikre død, ikke sant? Å få et HIV-positivt resultat. Og vi måtte jo, når man var kommet for å la seg teste, så måtte vi jo nødvendigvis, vi gjorde det jo alltid sånn at pasienten kom tilbake in persona for å hente testresultatet. Det var ikke noe snakk om å ringe eller sende brev eller sånn, med mindre de ikke kom. Men det er en helt annen og mer komplisert historie. Men det er klart det er et voldsomt sjokk. Det var det samme som å få en dødsdom. Ikke sant? Og det for en ung mann, det var jo stort sett unge menn det dreide seg om, så er det er ikke til å bære. Og det er ikke til å bære for helsearbeiderne heller. Så det var vel det aller tyngste og vanskeligste og mest krevende. Så derfor så brukte vi jo mye tid på å diskutere hvordan det skulle skje, hva man skulle si, og fremfor alt hva man ikke skulle si. Og da skulle man balansere det med realismen opp mot håpet. Og så er det noe jeg tenker tilbake på med jeg kjenner det inni meg fremdeles, faktisk, når jeg snakker om det nå. Det var ikke bare vanskelig for pasienten, det må jeg si.
Ja, og så hadde vi jo en sånn privat sæddonorring i Stavanger. Så jeg vet nå om 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 barn i alle fall.
Men hvor mange var det i denne ringen da? Hvor mange var det i denne donorringen da, cirka, av menn?
Ja, det varierte litt grann. Men det var sånn, det var ganske... Vi snakket med en mann. Betingelsen var at han var gift og hadde barn.
Altså han var hetero da, det var en forutsetning.
Ja, i hvert fall at han hadde barn.
Ja.
Og at han var gift. Og det gikk jo også på det der med HIV-AIDS. Fordi at da så var det jo ikke så mye testgreier og sånn, og alternativet var jo å gå på byen, men da visste du jo ikke hva du møtte på og sånn, av seksuelt overførbare sykdommer. Med HIV da som den verst tenkelige på det tidspunktet. Så det var liksom noen sånne kriterier. Ja, det var greit, jeg tok det. Jeg skal ta en sånn dilemma som jeg hadde på den etterpå. Så da var de kriteriene som vi snakket med mannen om han var interessert, eller kunne tenke seg det først. Og hvis han kunne tenke seg det, så gikk han hjem og snakket med kona. Og hvis kona var med på det, så var det jo opp til den lesbiske da, å finne ut når var det eggløsning, og var klar for inseminering. Så ga vi beskjed til donoren, og så var det også å få spermen raskest mulig til den kvinnen som skulle ha den. Han kunne se at han overleve da i 2 timer.
Then we know. Okay, the last slide I have for you to round it up is about, as was earlier mentioned, Skeivt kulturår 2022, 10 years later than the original one. And this is a year inviting practically everyone but so for museums, art institutions, media, students, and society in general to learn about queer culture and history. And the archives have been quite busy so far in serving all the requests for information and research regarding this. And here in Bergen, the University Museum are planning an exhibition, as is Kode, planning a very interesting exhibition. There will also be a conference at the university, and all over Norway there will be given a lot of attention to this. And I also want to mention that for the first time there will be produced a TV series on the queer history of Norway, which we are quite involved with, so I'm also very curious to see how that turns out. That's all I had, and here is our webpage if you want to have a further look, and you can also find my contact information there if you want to ask me any further questions or have any other things you want to ask about. Thank you.
Maybe I just round up by saying thank you to everybody. We run out of time in a way, and maybe we discuss here in the space or in other circumstances. But it was great to have you here. It was great. Thank you everybody watching online. Thank you especially to all 4 speakers here with us. Buy the books, buy Fast Plus, buy the book of Frank, buy Glue, buy and visit the Skeift-arkivet. Thank you so much, everybody. Yes, that was. There's no time for any questions or comments, or oops. Yeah, yeah. I mean, if people, I would be curious. Okay. No, it's more that the live stream ends at some point, but maybe we, yeah. Okay. Okay. Sorry, my phone ran out of battery, actually. Yeah. Do we have another microphone? Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Hello. So, Silje, you mentioned at the very beginning that you had been thinking about why 2022 is why now? Why is it important to celebrate and contextualize and bring forth the queer history of Norway at this time in history? I was interested to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, I don't need a year to be interested in that. So I think because, I mean, as an individual or as an artist, you know why it's important. So like, I grew up very close to these photographs where they've been stored. If I was a kid, or like as a queer kid, I wish I saw them because they would change the way I could have lived my teenage years, you know? So my own kind of, the sense of urgency and the need to kind of, to find those stories or to be actively involved in queer history is very, it's permanent. It's like, it never leaves you. So I think that kind of the year, that's when the kind of institutions come in, like all the, that's where the, yeah, museums, that's, so I mean, I think it's important, and it's important that there's like money being thrown into this, but I'm always also suspicious. But I actually think the question should be turned back to you, because you're working on this from an institutional perspective.
So, I don't know if I have a very specific answer to the question, but I am really interested in talking about that, because it is, I mean, to me it is, it's curious that this is happening now. I think, I mean, it's been 50 years since the decriminalization of gay sex in Norway. So it is quite late, I think, that that the big institutions, museums and archives, are starting to working with this theme of queerness, queer history, and so forth, this late in history. So I'm also interested in discussing that, because we see also worldwide that that big institutions aren't necessarily very prone to working with queer history or queer art or queer as a tool, as you've been talking about, as a way to criticize the norms and structures in our society. So for me, at least, it's very important that this queer culture year is not only about celebrating our queer history, but also critically discussing the very structures that make some people that kind of I don't know how I'm going to say it, but why some groups or people are being excluded in mainstream society, in institutions, and so forth. I think it's very important to kind of have this long-term perspective, that it's not about only marking this year, 2022, as a queer cultural year, but also setting some long-term goals. Yeah.
Can I just say that I think there's I understand the discussion going, and you know it's a continuous thing. And I think that if we look at it historically, you will also find in the queer sort of movement and the history of the queer organizations and what have you, that the sort of the duality there has always been there. Even back in the, if we go back to the 70s or whatever, when say from 72 and onwards, you had it also there. The kind of, do you want to pass as being gay but pass as a heterosexual, or do you want to preserve that right to be different? And I think that's a sort of similar lines that are all along the history. And also we have to remember that Kim Friele, for instance, she was criticized because she wanted to be too public. She demanded to be seen. And a lot of people were offended by that, other queer people, because they said, don't put the spotlight on us. We want to preserve this way of living as a more secretive, more hidden way of life for different reasons.
I think this is very apparent to, I mean, also if you spend lots of time outside of the Norway, this is very apparent to a Norwegian kind of way of thinking of queerness. It's like assimilation or like a difference. But I think what you're talking about is much more about power, and I think what is important is that we don't fall into tokenism, that we don't fall into like ticking off boxes because it gave you a certain grant, but like keep that conversation in the working of other exhibitions that are not representing queerness, or even like, because I think it has to do with power. Thinking of even Elisabeth her, the exhibition here, or like thinking of Siri Aurdal in Venice, that is work that is also coming from artists that have brought out other artists. And that's not necessarily has to do with queerness, but it has to do with feminism and practices like Eline and Elisa, who were doing work that at the time when they started doing their research, they were seen as like care workers working with these elderly women. Like people didn't like recognize the kind of importance of their work, and like now all these institutions are bringing out, which is great. But I think there's like, it is easy that you forget those structures and the kind of whole ecosystem, and especially in terms of institutions, because it becomes there's like a certain sloppiness sometimes that certain institutions can kind of I think also it's all about power somehow, and to kind of insist on it, not only in terms of on the year and the marking. But I'm excited to see what Skeivt kulturår, which I've been writing it lately, and I'm like misreading it, like I'm misspelling it, Skeivt kulturråd, and I'm wondering if there's like there's a very deep desire for me to like change kulturrådet, but into something skeivt. No, I'm excited to see, and I think let's not hold back, and like I'm not going to be critical of it. I'm just like, I'm kind of curious to see, because what is happening, for example, with the National Museum, they're very good at telling everyone the artists that have been forgotten, whilst other artists have not forgotten them. You know, there's like lots of contemporaries who have worked along them, and there's like a trajectory of exhibitions that have given time and focus to artist practices that they are now claiming to be forgotten. So I think there's just, there's an interesting ecosystem of practices and people and lives, and make sure to bring that out. And now there's an archive, so even more exciting. But I'm actually have questions to Skeivt Arkiv, which maybe we have to wrap up. But we can make it. No, in terms of how Skeivt Arkiv relates to other archives, because there's so many other international archives in Berlin and in LA. There's like the National Gay and Lesbian Archives, one archive. So have you looked to other archives in terms of how you structure and build your archive?
Well, one very important difference is that we are, and we try to make that clear as well, that we are archivists, we're not activists. So that's a clear difference, because in like many of the archives you refer to are maybe activist archives, some of them. Not all of them.
One archive is like it's under USC, so University of Southern California.
Yeah. So, but there's a difference there. So what we find though is that, like for all the other academic archives, of course we have an easier access and collaborations, what have you. Now, some of the activist archives have different goals, different things they want to focus on, and are not necessarily looking for the same type of working together.
I would love to continue. I think for the technical side we have to finish at 4, but maybe we can continue some questions here in 4 minutes.
15 minutes left of recording space.
Pardon?
We've got 15 minutes left of recording.
Okay, right. Okay. No, I think you're raising a really good point about like returning the question back to institutional representatives, and I think it's maybe that's the problem of tokenization, is that you bring in the voice to be the responsible curator and mediator of your own work in a way as well, and I think I think to bring in artists and collectives as the responsible individuals to kind of showcase and mediate their works can be viewed as a very one-sided dialogue to facilitate your political motivations, perhaps. It brings this question of with power comes responsibility, of course, on the other side, and to what extent are institutions also acting as the collaborator in terms of not just giving the space, but changing those structures from within. And I guess this is the sustainability that we're talking about for the future. I don't really have a question
directly related to that, because as somebody who crosses between those boundaries of curator, artist, publisher, I am very critical of this these tokenizing moments, and yeah, but I think maybe especially people who work within these activist fields, or are the artists being brought in, we tend to have a kind of closed ownership over our work as well. Recently worked with an artist, and I asked about responsibility. I said, where do you feel the responsibility lies between showing this kind of practice? And they said, it's fully on the artist. And I thought, maybe, yeah. But I think in an ideal world, as somebody who's crossing between these fields, it would be nice to also have the institution be a conspirator, a collaborator, somebody who's part of this gossip as well. Hi, Katarina. I see you on the screen, and I don't want to leave you out. And I think
I can hear you what you're saying. I hear everything.
Okay, fantastic. And I think maybe this is very visible in your practice as well, as somebody who creates those infrastructures, but is part of that system that hacks it from within as well. Hi, Axel.
I was thinking about that. I'd really like to comment that somehow, because it's really, coming from applied arts like architecture, it doesn't become such of a dilemma. Because I don't ever envision myself as an outlaw or an artist on the side. I'm already always within the institution somehow. Mm-hmm. And so I definitely think that institutions are good allies and that they should be conspirators.
Absolutely.
Of course, they need to be. And I'm kind of also questioning the idea that someone can stand outside. Of course you can't. I mean, the idea of the lonesome cowboy, that's just construction of the most powerful position. I hear myself echoing when I talk, so I kind of get a bit distracted when I speak. Let's see. Yeah, but like, for instance, in the project that I showed you, the ball cap, it was part of a large project about art in the public space in Sweden. And a lot of artists that are more like in like visual arts, they had dilemmas with that kind of collaborative aspect of the project, whereas we who are trained as designer and architects, it was more obvious for us how to collaborate with the civic society. And also that idea that, of course, when you enter into like really constructing things in the habitual world, in the physical matters, you will get dirty, your hands will get stained. I mean, you will, of course, we will play into like being some kind of mascots or token, something that you can show, oh, but we have ticked the box. We have this queer feminist collective, so now of course we will be used like, but that's never a reason for us not to enter into the project, because that's like dealing with the real world somehow. So we tend to get dirty.
Yeah, exactly. Not to be afraid to get our hands dirty.
Okay, so now I have to seriously, sadly, take the role of keeping the schedule. I'm very sorry. I would have also lots of more questions and comments, but I have to close the event. Thanks again, everybody. We stopped the live stream now.